Hey there! The second half of this week's study of Purgatorio is cantos 22 through 24, and as you might have noticed, I'm getting a little bit behind, but I'm trying and still continuing, even if slowly. Bum 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 bum, Purgatorio, bum 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 bum. So last time we had just met Statius, and we had that great scene where Statius meets Virgil, and it's really cool. But I also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Statius and his role in this part of the Purgatorio. We get to learn a whole lot more about Statius now that we spend a little bit more time with him, and he's actually going to go with the pilgrims throughout the rest of this part of the journey. He's going to travel with them up to the very top of Purgatory. And that's interesting because he doesn't actually have to. He could move a lot faster, but he doesn't. He stays back, and we find out why here shortly. Canto 22 picks up with a mention of the angel at the end of the cornice for the avaricious, and as usual he erases the P off of Dante's forehead and allows them to go on, and he recites another beatitude saying, "Blessed are they who thirst," but interestingly he does not say who hunger. The original beatitude says those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, but he leaves off one of those. He leaves off the hunger part, and the reason why, as we discover shortly after, is that he's saving that part of the beatitude for the end of the gluttony section, which makes a lot of sense because those who hunger for righteousness as opposed to following their earthly appetites will be blessed. You've noticed that every single time we meet one of the angels, they are singing a beatitude. Just to recap, in case you aren't super familiar with the Beatitudes, they're the beginning lines of the most famous sermon probably in the Bible that Jesus gives on the mountainside, and it is oftenly referred to as the Sermon on the Mount, and it takes up about 3 chapters in the book of Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7, but it opens with the Beatitudes, these statements of blessing, and they're all inversions, they're all reversals, much like we see over and over and over again in Purgatory, so they're very appropriate in Purgatory. But there are only 6 of them, and as we see, there are 7 steps, there are 7 cornices in Purgatorio, and so Dante splits one of them in half and uses half on one cornice and half on the next cornice, because that is an appropriate way to both get in all the Beatitudes, but also make it fit. Blessed are those who thirst after righteousness, as well as blessed are those who hunger after righteousness. And so we split that between the greedy and the gluttonous. And after they pass the angel, we get to hear from Virgil a little bit, his thoughts on Statius. Now, he lived before Statius, but he heard about Statius from Juvenal, who was a contemporary of Statius's, and when Juvenal died, he went down to limbo, and he had a conversation with Virgil about how great Statius was, and so Virgil came to love Statius through the speech of others, through the speech of Juvenal. He says, "When virtue lights in us a fire of love, that love ignites another within the soul that sees it burning." So by seeing him from a distance, he's still able to be ignited by his love for Statius, and for Statius, what Statius does, and for Statius's good heart. But it's really a lot about poetry. We talk a lot about poetry in these next few cantos. And Virgil calls himself a friend to Statius, and he feels this kinship, this connection, this friendship, which is an interesting idea. I will have to say, Giuseppe Mazzotta does a really great job of exploring the differences between Virgil and Statius, both in their poetic styles, in their poetic theme, and what that might mean, the implications of that throughout this. It's a little bit beyond my knowledge base, and so I recommend checking out Giuseppe Mazzotta's discussion of that in his wonderful Yale lectures. I'll link them down below. I hope you're still noticing how many times we reference love. Both we have that love that Virgil experiences for Statius, but also Statius recognizing that love, saying things like, "I hear love's voice in every word you say. Often, indeed, appearances give rise to groundless doubts in us and false conclusions, the true cause being hidden from our eyes." He doesn't want Virgil to feel bad about asking about his conversion. Now, Statius's conversion is really fascinating. Statius is the traditional Roman poet, and so he represents another kind of Virgil, sort of a descendant of Virgil, a poetic descendant of Virgil, someone who studied Virgil and someone who wrote poetry after him. And he is not only the Roman and a Roman poet, but he is also a Christian in Dante's version. And so the fact that this is someone who both sort of is not as good as Virgil, but a parallel to Virgil, who also achieves spiritual success, puts him in an interesting position, because he's not only he may not be quite as successful poetically as Virgil, but he is greater than Virgil in his spiritual accomplishments by actually attaining salvation instead of simply attaining limbo. And we see him sort of as a transition point, I think, in this book. Virgil has been Dante's guide all the way up till now. And so we sort of see the transition from that classical knowledge of poetry that we see in Virgil to the spiritual overcoming, the spiritual success and spiritual victory that ultimately we will achieve in heaven. And we're transitioning from Virgil to Beatrice. And Statius is kind of that turning point, someone who both understands the classical poetry and still responds to that, as Dante does, but also has achieved spiritual growth and ultimately the trajectory towards paradise. And this becomes even more interesting when we discover that Statius, his spiritual transformation, his conversion, happens through Virgil's poetry. By reading Virgil's poetry, Statius came to understand his own faults and ultimately turned away from them and towards Christianity and towards a spiritual outcome, and ultimately was able to be saved and head towards heaven. That's really fascinating, because Virgil, who is a pagan poet, now a good one, but a pagan, his poetry actually helps Statius convert, actually helps guide him towards Christianity. And so this discussion of birth and of the greatness of birth leads him towards the birth of Christ. Virgil's not talking about Christ, but he's talking about a significant birth, and that leads him to the idea of the Christian idea of birth and rebirth, and other ideas as well. And Statius actually misquotes, perhaps, according to the notes both of Chardi and Mazzatta, he misquotes Virgil here, but maybe that shows a little bit about how you can take an idea from poetry and take it to heart and take it maybe in a way that it wasn't originally intended, but actually take something good out of it and bring something good out of it. There's an interpretive aspect of that. Now, the same idea has been explored already, right? Back at the beginning of Inferno, when we talked to Francesca, who took this poetry, took the poetry of Dante and his friends, the sweet new style, and took the lines about love and took them personally and took them to heart, but in all the wrong ways, right? She used poetry as an excuse to be lustful, as an excuse to commit adultery in a really horrible way, which leads her to hell. And in the end, she's like, it's not my fault, it's poetry's fault, it's love's fault. And she blames poetry. Well, here, Statius is crediting Virgil's poetry with his salvation. We see quite the opposite effect. And so there is that aspect of poetry that is open to the interpretation of the individual. The individual is able to take great ideas from that poetry and either use them for good or for evil. Ultimately, it's in the individual's own power of will. But poetry has that power to lead people towards good or towards ill. And both are possibilities. And Virgil is also a little bit confused how Statius, whose poetry seems to understand this sort of cathartic idea, how he could have been so wrapped up in something so dry and earth-based as avarice, how he could have been a greedy person if his poetry seems to show such a sincere and open heart. And Statius clarifies the fact that he wasn't into hoarding wealth, it was rather his lack of appreciation for wealth and the fact that he spent it too readily that led him to spend time on the last cornice with the avaricious. Because it's not just avaricious, but avaricious and prodigal. Just like they were paired in Inferno, they're paired again here. And Statius points out, oh yeah, I wasn't stuck to my wealth, but it was my lack of understanding of the value that I didn't see until later that allowed me to, that got me into this sin. And while they're speaking of all this, they are, of course, beginning to walk on the sixth cornice, and as usual, they turn right. And for the first time, they don't actually ask anybody or worry about asking anybody. They're just like, We've turned right every single time. We should probably turn right here too, because, that's symbolic and all. And because Statius doesn't challenge that, they presume that they're right. Statius ought to know. After all, he's the one going this way. Virgil said, "I think we ought to go with our right shoulders to the outer ledge, circling the slope as we have done before." So custom served to guide us, and we went as Virgil said. So they're finally, getting the pattern down. Always go right. And before we get to the gluttonous souls, we come across the whip of gluttony, which is a tree. There's this tree with these beautiful fruits on it, but it's kind of an inaccessible tree. It's a tree that's oddly shaped, where everything is really high and it's very narrow at the bottom, so you're not able to reach any of the fruit. And because of that, it's out of reach, and it's out of reach of these souls. But not only that, but there's a voice that comes out of the tree and forbids them to take of the fruit, which sounds really familiar, doesn't it? It sounds just like the Adam and Eve story, where they were forbidden to take the fruit from the tree. And in fact, there's more connection between the Garden of Eden and the trees that we're going to see here. There are 2 trees on this cornice, and there's a lot of debate over how those 2 trees are connected. Are they opposites? Are they sort of just a repetition of the same idea? What does it mean? But one shouts out the whip, and the other shouts out the rain. So here we have the whip of gluttony. And as you remember from the whips previously, each of the cornices have a statement of a virtue that helps you to overcome that particular sin. And it always starts with Mary. So the first one, Mary thought more of what was due the joy and honor of the wedding feast than of her mouth, which still speaks prayers for you. So we have this moment where Mary was at the wedding feast and she thought of others. She was thinking of others, and so she had the wine filled, not for her own enjoyment, but for the sake of the host. And so instead of thinking of her own mouth, she's thinking of others, and doing that sort of outward thinking. We also mentioned the mothers of Rome, and Daniel, and the Golden Age, and John the Baptist. So we actually hit more than 3 whips this time, which is unusual. Usually we stick to the normal 3. Every once in a while there's a variation. This is one of those variations. We have 5 instead. But each of these souls is showing temperance, is not feeding the self, but is thinking outwardly, and thinking of holiness rather than food. At the beginning of Canto 23, Dante becomes slightly absorbed in where the voice from the tree comes from, and he's trying to figure out the mechanism or whatever. Where does this voice come from? And as he sometimes is, he's distracted by what's unimportant. Instead of listening to the voice, he's paying too much attention to where it comes from, the wrong idea. And he has to be directed from a physical thing, where the voice comes from, to a spiritual thing, the true meaning of the voice. As he is often in Purgatory. He's so focused on the physical, he has to be reminded it's the spiritual thing that matters here. Again, Statius is that same idea, the physical to the spiritual. And as usual, Virgil again corrects him. He says, "My more than father said, 'My son, come now, for we must portion out more wisely the time allotted us.'" Let's use our time better than this. Figuring out the mechanism, that's not so important. Let's actually learn something from this. Notice how he says, "my more than father." Again, even though Virgil has been less effective in his directions, I guess, in Purgatorio, he's still very, very close to Dante. He's a father, and he's more than a father. He's a father and a guide and a friend, and so much to Dante. And that makes his upcoming disappearance all the more sad. And we come across the souls of the Gluttons, and we hear them speak, and their prayer, which we have a prayer on each corner, their prayer this time is, "Open my lips, Lord, that I may sing your praise." And so their prayers is, again, about the mouth, but it's not about feeding the mouth. Instead, it's about doing something more appropriate, taking the spiritual route with it. Instead of being focused on the physical, taking the spiritual. I'm not going to feed my mouth, instead I'm going to praise God with my mouth. And he sees the souls, and the souls are so wasted away with famine and hunger that they're unrecognizable. Their bodies are so sunken and emaciated in a really sort of a horrifying way. And he goes to great lengths to describe that. He talks about the face tracing the Omo Dei, which is something that people said that God signed his handiwork, and there's sort of each part of your body represents a letter. And so the letters spell out man is of God. But Dante's not really talking about that philosophy. He's just pointing out, oh yeah, if you're talking about the letters, that M is really clear, because you see these huge sunken eyes, and the M of Omo is very distinct because of the sunkenness of the people's faces. And here he comes across one of his friends. Now, I would like to stop and point out here that there might be a connection between the Gluttons of Inferno and the Gluttons of Purgatorio, in that both of them, because it's a very physical kind of sin, it's a sin against the body. Both of these have bodies that have been so transformed by their punishment that they are unrecognizable. Remember Chaco down in the Inferno, who was such a glutton, and their bodies are bloated sacks because of the way they were constantly stuffing their stomach sacks. And they're no longer recognizable. Their bodies have sort of lost their distinction. They become these blobs floating in muck. While here, in Purgatorio, they are quite the opposite. They are so emaciated, they're no longer recognizable. But there's that parallel between the two. And he sees one of his old friends, Forese, who is also a relative of his wife, Gemma. And although he doesn't recognize him, we have this sort of warm greeting between the two of them. And they talk about the sin of gluttony and how the punishment here on Purgatorio works. In this particular cornice, they walk around the circle, and each time they pass the tree, the smell of the tree and the water flowing from the tree makes them even more hungry. And so they are perpetually reminded of their hunger, and that, again, is that purifying process. And we have seen a similar sort of track in the Inferno when we had the sowers of discord who went around the circle and were continually chopped in pieces and divided. Well, here the souls are continually reminded of their hunger as they move around the circle. That same sort of circular continuation. And as Forese talks about his pain, it's interesting that he mentions, oh, we're constantly reminded of our pain. But then he corrects himself. He says, did I say pain? I should say gift of grace. For the same will that drives us to the tree drove Christ on gladly to cry, Eli, Eli, when he paid with his blood to set us free. And so, although they're driven into their pain, that drive towards pain is a purgation. It is a cleansing that will ultimately get them towards heaven. And it's the same sort of drive that led Christ to sacrifice himself for their sins. They're sacrificing themselves to pay for their own sins, of course, but it's still that drive of sacrifice which ultimately leads to a greater good. And so even though it's painful, he doesn't recognize it as pain. He recognizes it as a gift of grace. And so each of these ideas, as we've seen throughout Purgatorio, the souls are very happy to be punished because they know it gets them that much closer to heaven. And Dante is sort of surprised because Forese seemed to have sort of stuck to his gluttony until near the end of his life. So how is it that he's made it so far already? He hasn't been dead that long. And he points out, Forese talks about his wife and how his sweet wife Nella wept so many tears for him and prayed so hard for him that it got him through a lot of these stages much more quickly. And here he is nearing the end thanks to his wife's tears. And he uses her as a Christian example in contrast to the rest of the women in Florence. How the women of Florence are really immodest. We have all kinds of immodesty and all kinds of immodest dress and action. And again, the people are so focused on the physical that they've forgotten the spiritual. That contrast there. And then Forese asks Dante for his explanation. How are you here? Why do I see your shadow? The same sort of questions that we get every single time. Dante is still physical and everyone's still very much awed by that. And Dante does something interesting. He sort of talks about his physical life back home with Forese that he is trying to leave behind. And he mentions Beatrice as his spiritual goal. And so he's talks about that transition using the help of Virgil from that very physical existence he used to have to a more spiritual walk. Again, reminding us of the Gluttons, the way they're sort of focused on their physicality. They're focused on their own bodies and their own appetites instead of on spiritual things. And he points out Virgil, he also points out Statius. And as we move into Canto 24, Dante continues talking about Statius and points out that Statius is taking his time, out of respect for Virgil, which points out the fact that Statius doesn't seem to really be fully spiritually focused at this moment either. He's so excited to be with Virgil and to spend time with his great hero poet, although that hero poet did lead him to God, that he is putting the physical things, the more temporal and earthly things, above his speed towards heaven and above his spiritual goal. And that's kind of interesting, and that's going to be a bit of a problem for Dante later on. So that prioritizing the physical things has been seen as a problem throughout Purgatorio. It's repeated over and over and over again, right? All the way back at the beginning, we saw the singing and how they stopped and they slowed down, and all the souls were paused to appreciate the singing and the music and poetry, which are earthly things and are good things, but they needed to hurry on and move on towards heaven. And so we're reminded again and again throughout Purgatory that it's very easy to lose sight of the greatest things by looking at just things that are good. Something might be really good and might be really good for us, but if that becomes our ultimate goal instead of the truest and highest good, we're going to be veering the wrong direction. Maybe I'm not going out to do something awful, but I'm losing sight of the greater good, and therefore my track is slowed. My track is maybe misdirected, and sometimes I even go wrong by focusing on the good rather than the great. This is very different from Inferno, where everything was all about just leaving good behind altogether and veering downward. Everything in Inferno was so dark and so selfish and so miserable that Purgatory is a big transition. Here we realize that even things that are good sometimes can't be our entire focus. Here we point out a few other important people who are among the Gluttons, and we also talk about some other members of Forese's family who are in different locations, like gone straight on to heaven. His sister Picarda is straight on there. We see a lot of really good examples of females who seem to just go straight to heaven, in contrast to the general Florentine women that Dante seems to have a problem with. But we also get to meet Bonajonta, who talks to Dante for a few moments, and they talk about poetry, again repeating the ideas of poetry that were introduced in the last canto. And they talk about two different styles of poetry. Dante's sweet new style, which is his style of poetry that he starts with his friends, if we remember, Guido de Cavalcante and others like that. And also Bonajonta's style of poetry, which Bonajonta makes comparison between the two. And he points out that the way they followed love's dictation was really what set them apart. He says, we were almost as good as you, but you had that one extra thing. You followed the dictation of love. And as love is such an important idea in Purgatorio, it's interesting that, again, he points out that Dante's style of poetry, the sweet new style, is this poetry that is veering towards love, or talking about love, using love as sort of a primal kind of idea. But it's also interesting that that he is kind of, both Dante is kind of boasting here by putting these ideas into Bonajonta's mouth, but also he is showing a little bit of tension between these two styles. Is my style so much better than your style, etc. Maybe that sort of mirrors Statius and Virgil as well. There are sort of differing ideas about poetry. There's sort of the tension between those two ideas about poetry. At least Giuseppe Mazzotta has some interesting ideas on that. Again, it's a bit over my head. It's more than I have had time to study and understand in depth. So you should probably check him out. And Forese is still following with Dante, and we have this really touching moment between the two of them. Forese stays back. This moment with Forese really reminds me of that moment on the Plain of Burning Sands with Brunetto Latini in some ways. There's some similarities in structure. First of all, it's deeply personal, similar to the way that Brunetto Latini was very personal, Dante's teacher, the conversation he had there. But also there's some imagery of the way that Forese sort of holds back and waits until the rest of the pack move forward because he wants to linger with Dante as long as possible. And then that moment in the end when he gets to the end of his length and he knows, I have to catch up, I need to get back on track, and so he hurries on ahead, reminds us very much of the way Brunetto Latini at the end of that section dashes off and seems to be running a race. There's a lot of similarity, I think, between those two there. Plus, both of them prophesy about something bad coming. They will talk about about what's going to happen. And Forese asks, when shall we meet again? You know, it's so good to see you. I hope that we're together again soon. And Dante doesn't know the answer, but he says, I do not know how long my life will be, but I cannot return so soon, but what my wish will reach the shore before me. So he feels this desire to see Forese again. There's a very close personal connection here. And Dante can be much more kind and close to Forese because he is going to see Forese again. There will be that moment of reuniting because ultimately they're both going to the same direction, they're both going to the same place. Dante's going to have some stops along the way. Of course, he has to live out the rest of his life. He also has to spend a little bit of time down there in the Pride section, you know. But ultimately he's going to get to heaven as well. And he also recognizes again that his time in Florence is going to be filled with, as he mentions, bloody strife and ruin. And Forese mentions a prophecy about one of the men who's going to help bring about the ruin of Florence, bring about the coming of the Black Gulfs and the overtaking of the city of Florence and all the violence that's going to lead to Dante's ultimate exile, is actually partially the fault of Forese's own brother. And so because of that, he's prophesying the doom of his brother and the way his brother's going to have that role there. At least that's what I get from the notes of Chardy, who's very excellent usually. And we end, like I said, with that moment of running ahead. It says, now I must leave you far behind. Your pace has cost me a considerable delay, and time is precious to us in this place. Because in hell, everything's eternal. It's a constant circle. And we had that moment where Brunetto Latini is running like one who wins the prize, and he's not. He's in a constant eternal circle that will never end, which is his eternal torment. But here, Forese is actually running towards a prize. There is an end to it. Time is precious. We're moving towards a goal. And so there's a big distinction and difference between those two. And we have this great metaphor of a knight charging ahead for honor, similar to the racing metaphor, but this one's not ironic. At times during a horse charge, one brave knight will spur ahead, burning to claim the honor of having struck the first blow in the fight. Just so his lengthened stride left us behind, and I trailed on, accompanied by those two who were such mighty marshals of mankind. As we turn around, there's the second tree, and once again they're forbidden to approach the tree, forbidden to take anything from the tree, but from this tree we hear the reign of gluttony, the warning against those who are gluttons, and the consequences that come from that. We see the story of the centaurs who drank too much wine and went crazy and had to be beaten by Theseus. We see the story of Gideon's soldiers, the Gideon who had this huge army and he was supposed to cull them all out and weed them down to just the 300 that he's going to go fight with, and several of them drank from the river in a way that didn't show that showed their greed for thirst instead of their propriety and their attention. And so ultimately those were weeded out. And they walk on and they meet the next angel. And once again, we remove the next P and they're on their way to the final cornice. And here we hear again the blessed are they who grace so lights within that love of food in them does not excite excessive appetite, but who take pleasure in keeping every hunger within measure. So we see that instead of seeking hunger, they hunger for what's right, hunger for righteousness. All right, so that brings us to the end of Canto 24, and next time we'll talk about Cantos 25, and the next 6 cantos. We'll probably talk about it in 2 videos, and I'm a bit behind now, but I'm going to try to get caught up. I'm going to try to get to work the next several nights in a row and get us caught up on these notes. Thank you so much for watching, and we're getting very close to the end. We're coming up on the Lustful, and then we'll finally reach the Garden of Eden. Now these 2 trees that we saw among the gluttonous are connected to the idea of the Garden of Eden. The voice from the tree points out that this tree here is connected to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that Eve ate from, which caused the fall of man. This tree is from the same root. What does that make the other tree? Does that make the other tree the tree of life? Or does it make the other tree some kind of other counterpoint? Or is it the same tree, just a different version of it? Anyway, so it's connected to that idea of when Eve ate the fruit that led to ultimate awful repercussions. We're reminded again that we have to be careful what we put in ourselves. We have to be careful of our mouths. Feeding our appetites and feeding our hungers over spiritual things can lead to destruction. as we've seen in this section. Alright, next time we'll get on to lust, which is the last section, just as it was the first section in Inferno. Alright, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Bum 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 bum, Purgatorio, bum 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 bum.